Today on Uncommon Knowledge, is the left being left behind?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today has the American left lost its way. In 1960, Democratic presidential candidate John Kennedy ran to the right of Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon, arguing that under Republicans, the United States had become too weak in the Cold War. Just a dozen years later, the Democratic Party had been captured by the forces supporting presidential nominee George McGovern. Hawkish in 1960, dovish by 1972. How did that happen to the Democratic Party? What forces were at work among intellectuals and activists on the left? And what does the history of the American left over these last several decades imply for John Kerry, the Democratic Party, and the war on terror today? Joining us, two guests. Christopher Hitchens is a correspondent for Vanity Fair magazine. And Applebaum is a columnist for the Washington Post and the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Gulag, A History. In 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy ran to the right of Richard Nixon, citing, among other things, a missile gap that he argued the Republicans under Eisenhower had permitted to develop. But a mere dozen years later, in 1972, the Democratic Party is captured by George McGovern. Journalist Norman Podhoretz, quote, "Never will I get over my amazement at the speed with which the new left point of view spread from the margin to the mainstream, and the Democratic Party caved in to the radical insurgency," close quote. What happened?
By the way, Bill Clinton ran against George Bush from the right in '92, also on Cuba, accusing him of not bringing down the hammer hard enough with the Helms-Burton bill. And you might say he ran against him from the right on Israel too, because he was for, Clinton was for Shamir, and George Bush was for the Israeli Labour Party. So these ideas are unlikely to leave us anytime soon. There is a one-word answer to the question, which is Vietnam. I don't see why Podhoretz has any right to be astonished at the speed with which people became convinced that that was an evil war, as well as a very misjudged one, or badly formulated one. And it seemed to have tremendous implications for the idea of America, not as the arsenal of democracy in Europe, was the guarantor of what used to be called the captive nations, the Stalinized nations of Eastern Europe, but as a colonial power, a bully. And also, which was not without significance, a racist power. I mean, pounding brown people, if you like, or yellow people, at the same time as having a civil rights revolution. The coincidence of those two, the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement in tandem,
and
of course remade the American landscape, as they should have done.
Let me give you a little bit more of Norman Podhoretz.
No, but you must.
I must. In this case, I must. Those who captured the Democratic Party abandoned, quote, support for the policy of containing Soviet expansion, which the Democrats had followed pretty consistently since the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947. And this abandonment takes place, and just at the moment when the Soviets were launching the greatest military build-up in peacetime history, close quote. Now, that's also a result of Vietnam? And does it follow naturally or logically from Vietnam?
It's not only a result of Vietnam. I mean, I think several things were happening simultaneously. I mean, Christopher's absolutely right. Vietnam changed Americans' view of themselves in the world. You know, are we a good moral power? Are we a imperialist negative power? And many people shifted from the first category to the second category. It was also at a time, though, when people began to criticize the United States domestically on a number of issues, civil rights, women's issues, so on. And thirdly, it was actually a moment when, you know, for whatever reason, because of these things or because of other things, there was a revival of interest in Marxism as an idea that is worth following and that there might be something to it.
Okay, now let me quote you to yourself. How's that? Anne Applebaum. Why did so many Western liberals fail to absorb the full horror of Stalinism? Why does Stalinism still not inspire anywhere near the same kind of horror as Nazism today? I long to hear, you write, Hitchens answer these points. Do you have an answer for that one?
I can't believe I missed this when it was in print. I would have written to you by now.
I give you the opportunity.
It is a very good question. Well,
it was in the context of Martin Amis attacking you.
Yes, right.
It was the review.
You also write, listen, let me give you a little bit more of yourself to set it up fairly. Quoting you, the masses, the struggle, the proletariat, the exploiters and exploited, the ownership of the means of production, these were all terms close to the hearts of the Western left, close quote. Sort this all
I know what Anne's question is addressed to the American intellectuals, not to the
circus
or the policymakers. And there are several answers to it. One is that if you took, say, the magazine Partisan Review, which was founded in the 1930s and became the main organ of the anti-Stalinist left, probably the most anti-Stalinist magazine in the country, and was the launching pad or introduction, if you into American letters and life, public intellectual life of George Orwell and Arthur Koestler and Ignazio Salome and a number of other people like that. Now this, of course, is not by any means a mainstream tradition, but it did have a big fallout effect in the world of American magazines, to some extent in the academy. It didn't prevent the Stalinization of a lot of American intellectuals. And if you ask the question why so many of them were much less horrified by Stalinism, not that they ought to be, but in the formulation that Anne came up with, in comparison to Nazism, there's a fairly, again, simple one-word answer. A huge number of them were Jewish. No Jewish person is going to look, especially if their family is originally from Tsarist Russia, they're never going to look on anything of Russian communism with the same pure horror and fear and revulsion that they're going to bring to the reaction to Nazism.
I'm sorry. But why didn't the left have a more accurate and therefore more critical picture of Stalinism? If they have any notion of what's taking place in the Gulag, they ought to hate.
Well, there are a number of things that happen, during the war and after the war.
The Second World War is what
Second World War. I'm talking about the Second World War now. That changed that affected the perception, the left, not only the left's perception of the Gulag, but the right's perception of the Gulag, the center's perception of the Gulag, the liberals' perception of the Gulag. One is that Stalin was our ally, and we fought this good war, and this was the war that we. This was a moral war, this was the right war, we were right to fight it. We fought it alongside a dictator. And it was unacceptable at the time, and it remains amazingly difficult now for people to say, right, we defeated one genocidal dictator with the help of another genocidal dictator. People are uncomfortable saying that. It undermines their vision of the war. It disturbs their understanding of what happened in history. And people remain, to this day, people are uncomfortable when you hear that.
So there's a kind of gauze through which we will view Stalin.
That was quite powerful. There's another thing that happens earlier, and this is maybe returning to your original point. And one of the oddities of the left's perception of the Soviet Union is that in the very beginning, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, the great opponents of Lenin and the people who were at first the biggest critics were the left. The Western left in the 1920s wrote endlessly about what a tragedy the Bolshevik Revolution was, how many of its victims, because of course its first
victims... the wrong man came out on top? Or?
No, because its first victims were other socialist parties. And so the first people who went to jail and the first people who went to prisons were the
Bertrand Russell's book on the theory and practice of Bolshevism is undoubtedly the earliest, most prescient.
Right.
It was written by someone who considered himself a left socialist.
Right. And then what happens in the 30s is, particularly in this country, is that people from the United States begin going to Russia to find out. This is at the moment of, there's a kind of crisis here. It's 1929, there's a depression, and people begin to go to Russia to look at why it's succeeding, or what lessons we might learn there that we can bring back here. And this is the era of Walter Duranty, and this is the era of the New York Times correspondent who described the 5-year plan. And he actually won his Pulitzer Prize for explaining in his articles why the 5-year plan was working and what was so great about it.
Right.
And this was something people wanted to hear.
Anne's Pulitzer Prize for the Gulag a nice act of journalistic revenge, or cancels it out.
So you get throughout the 30s this idea that we can learn something from
When does The Guardian send Malcolm Muggeridge?
About that time.
And Muggeridge sees through it.
Muggeridge was determined to go to overpraise, and maybe because of that, because of the diminished expectation, what he would have analysed, I think, would have been
Malcolm Muggeridge, British journalist, who came back and said this is a nightmare taking place.
He was one of the many reporters who were beginning to do that. André Gide in France was doing the same thing. Having gone to praise, they came back quite so stunned by what they see.
Goldman, actually.
Edward Goldman, but what Orwell would have called this would have been power worship. People begin to think here's this huge country that's beginning to industrialize itself. Maybe the cost is high, the human cost will be high, always accumulating capital, but they began to think they were on the winning side of history. People like Alger Hiss, for example, join up, in my view, at that point, quite clearly for that reason. They have no politics, they have no principles of any sort. Whittaker Chambers joined the Communist Party at a time it was a very dangerous thing to do. One of the reasons he fell out with Hiss was he realized Hiss was joining because he thought he was on the winner.
The glamour of sheer power.
Power worship among the intellectuals is something you simply cannot underestimate.
But it's not only the far left. It's not only.
Yeah, you've got to. There's a lot of it around, is what I'm saying.
Right. It's not only the far left. I mean, FDR gets interested in this, and there are some New Dealers begin to go to Russia.
And FDR's ambassador to Russia, Joseph Davies, was it?
Joseph Davies.
Who's a fool, isn't he?
Initially,
totally
yes.
gullible, or is it power worship there as well?
Power
he sends back glowing reports.
If you mean the mission to Moscow, is an exercise in power worship.
Is it? All right.
Yes.
Let's fast forward from the Second World War to the 1970s.
One way or another, this power worship, this admiration, this gullibility, all these things combined in the 20s and 30s among the intellectual left is bleeding into the mainstream of the Democratic Party in some way or other, informing the new left in the 70s. Is that simply wrong? Is there something to it? How would you state the case?
I think there is something to it. I think what happens is you get in the 60s, you get a kind of rediscovery of Marxism. You know, when there's this moment, there's this great criticism of our country, there's a crisis, much as there was in 1929. You know, it's not working, you know, we were wrong about how we thought things were supposed to go, and there's a revival of Marxism, there's an interest in Marxism, and that happens simultaneously with a reluctance to criticize the Soviet Union because the language used, as you were quoting before, by Soviet communism is close to things that we would like to, they would like, you know, we would like to tell, you know, some of the same words.
All right, what's your view?
Well, but the new left, by definition, if there's only one actually definitive term that can be used to describe it, is post-1956. Its origins are a revulsion from Stalinism, or revulsion against it, and a critique of the Soviet.
In this country?
Yes, everywhere. I mean, that's what new left means. It just means that. It means people who broke with communism in 1956. It doesn't mean anything else, I can promise you. Allow me to know
that's what the...
And many of these people, classically, say David Horowitz, who would have considered himself one of the founders of the new left, would be considered by me to be, are people who come from Communist Party families.
Yeah,
they rebel against
that's a very sophisticated intellectual understanding of what the new left is.
No, well, it's nice of you to put it like that. It's also the only definition of the new left. That's what it means.
No, but if you talk
now,
about
the area of revolution, then no, I haven't started. Got my trousers off yet. The areas of interest also shift. Everyone's bored with the grey tedium of the Warsaw Pact countries, but what there does seem to be is a renewal of revolution in the Third World, particularly in Cuba and in Vietnam.
Right.
To some extent in China, there were some people who were Maoists at that point. It was a way of being anti-Soviet, a doomed way, but a certain way. Well, this is all essential to know and to remember and to understand, because that actually also was what a lot of the world looked like at the time. Rebellions in Latin America and the Caribbean, a rebellion in South Africa where the CIA has helped to lock up Nelson Mandela, war and revolution in Indochina. None of these things were invented by the new left. They seem to answer something
from intellectuals to the mainstream. Let me repeat that question. The 70s occur, and you've got a couple of reactions. Vietnam occurs, and you've got a couple of reactions in the late 60s and the early 70s within the Democratic Party, and broadly speaking, the left of center, let's put it that way, to avoid the term new left. And one is Scoop Jackson, who says Vietnam was a terrible mistake. On the other hand, we must do what Harry Truman set out to do, and what must be continued until it's no longer necessary, and stand up to and contain the Soviet Union. Why is that not the dominant view in the Democratic Party? That Scoop Jackson is on the margins, so much on the margins that the Norman Podhoretzes and indeed the John Podhoretzes.
Why would you take my answer? It's that they have a bad conscience about the Third World, as it used to be called.
Well,
with some good reason. A lot of the mainstream liberal Democrats really felt bad about the United States' posture in what we used to call the Third World. For example, towards South Africa, to give you a salient example, or towards Chile. And they never got over what they did to Vietnam, and nor should they. There is a perfectly...
And isolation is...
There's nothing mysterious about your question, or I hope my answer.
And do you accept that?
I think that is true. I think I would also make the point, though, that there began to be a reluctance to condemn the Soviet Union, simply because, you know, it was like letting down the side. You know, okay, if we condemn them too much, that means that you know, that's too positive about us. You know, they're part of the left, we're part of the left. We don't want to be too.
It's disagree with you again, but I mean, in my opinion, the invasion of Czechoslovakia by at least that date. Any feeling of
1968.
amity, fraternities also is completely gone. Everyone is just, that's the end. The mainspring breaks.
Okay,
the
move
fellows
forward,
having
move
left
forward
by
to, you know, the 80s.
Right.
Okay, you know, in the 80s, you would have people who would say, we don't want to talk too harshly about the Soviet Union because then that would sound like we're being too pro-Reagan. I mean, you begin to get this.
I thought I could sometimes hear people saying that, or guess that that's what they meant, but no one would actually have put it quite as crudely.
People didn't put it quite that way. I mean.
Next topic. To what extent did William Jefferson Clinton move the Democrats in a new direction? Norman Podhoretz for the last time, Christopher. All right. Norman makes the point that Clinton sends troops into Haiti. He engages in an air campaign against Serbia. He's as vigorous as a president could be under the rules of engagement in policing the no-fly zone in Iraq. So on, it sends cruise missiles into the Sudan in an incident that Christopher has chronicled in detail. Norman Podhoretz, Bill Clinton is a scoundrel, yet it is this scoundrel who has pushed and pulled his party into moving in a healthier direction than it had been heading in since its unconditional surrender to the left nearly 30 years ago. Close quote. In other words, Clinton, Democratic president, re-engages the Democratic Party in the international scene and establishes that Democrats are once again willing to use force in the pursuit of American interest. Fair assessment of Bill Clinton?
In a simple sense, yes.
Okay, take it to the next level of complexity. Where is it unfair?
Clinton's international rhetoric was always lacking. I mean, he would often intervene in these places and it wasn't quite clear why. That was partly a function of the era. I mean, this was not an era with a sort of central organizing principle like the Cold War or like the War on Terrorism.
Which brings us to the day before yesterday, the Democratic primaries. Voters face a choice of, among others, Joseph Lieberman, Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, Democrat, who supports the war on terror unambiguously, and Howard Dean, former governor of Vermont, who denounces much of the effort also unambiguously. We know that John Kerry wins the nomination, of course, but the interesting contest here is between those two who are so unambiguous in their position on the war. Joe Lieberman wins not a single primary, but Howard Dean finishes a close second. He has tremendous support. What does that say?
He doesn't win primary, but I know what you mean. Well, that's why, now don't you wish you'd taken my point about the third world? The mutation of what I was saying earlier.
Give us the mutation, that's what I mean.
Is into exactly this feeling that if there's another rebellion in the duskier part of the globe, a lot of people on the left are in some odd way pre-programmed to think there must be something, if not okay about it, not all that bad. That they mistake the forces of jihad for some sort of insurgency. Indeed, they very often call jihad forces insurgents or rebels as if that's what they were, instead of reactionaries and medievalists. It's a very important mistake. And it also means the leftists moved from being status quo, conservative, to being actually reactionary, to supporting the cause of reaction.
And they furthermore mistake our activities as colonial and the old-fashioned.
Not so much a mutation as a metastasis, if you think about it like that. It means the left has completely betrayed everything it used to stand for. And done so in a manner that's practically treasonous. Well, you see, I mean, just on the Clinton thing, if I may.
Yes.
I mean, Clinton becomes president. He's the first man to take the oath of office after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. I mean, it's all over. He's got a wonderful opportunity to redo foreign policy, of which he makes almost nothing. And by the way, he said he would help the Bosnians during the election campaign. He let that run for 2 years. He had to intervene when it was nearly a disaster. Nothing will ever efface the shame of what he refused to do, even given advice of what was going to happen in Rwanda.
Before I go on to the next question, would you like to?
No, I didn't disagree with that at all. I mean, one of the it actually is, it's similar to what I was saying. I mean, he went into Haiti, because he felt he had to. The circumstances made him. In Bosnia, he said he would intervene, then he didn't, then he did. Each one of these changes of mind actually affected the war on the ground, and changed the situation. And it was only, he kept being reluctantly torn into these things. I mean, so yes, it's true that he used force in a way that no Democratic president had in recent times, but it was with unclear aims. There was a lot of talk about internationalism that wasn't backed up.
I might add here that most of the Senate and Congressional Republican Party was opposed to the rescue operation in Bosnia, as it was in Kosovo.
Yes,
that deserves to be said, I think.
Right.
So it was absolutely in favor of doing nothing about Rwanda. And a large chunk of the right wing still think that the war on terror is a war for Israel or a war for liberalism or something that America should stay out of. So this is not a left-right question.
From the day before yesterday. Now, the war on terror. Are the Democrats up to the task? all of this, which is taking through the Cold War, Bill Clinton's, in some sense, the argument would be that he remakes the center of the Democratic Party into internationalist and willing to use force and so forth. And now we are in the war on terror. And the question is the Democratic Party and the American left up to it?
I think there are different parts of the Democratic Party and different parts of the left. I mean, as you've said. So I mean, I think of
is there a battle?
I think of the, as Christopher would put it, the pro-jihad left. I think of being not necessarily the center of the Democratic Party. I think of John. Sorry, no, certainly not. And I think there is a war within the Democratic Party clearly over this issue.
So in deciding,
I don't think you can identify, just as actually as Christopher again was right, you can't identify the pro-communists, with the Democratic Party throughout the post-war period either.
I think this is more than just instinct on my part. The reaction of a lot of Democrats and Liberals to the September 11th events was obviously in common with everyone else. Revulsion, disgust, hatred, and so on. But when they considered it politically, I think a lot of them couldn't say this, but they thought, that's the end of our agenda for a little while. We're not really talking very much about welfare and gay marriage, and so we're going to be living in law and order times now. And the instinct is to think, well, that must favor the right wing. Surely that creates a climate for the conservatives, law and order and warfare and mobilization and so forth. In fact, the Second World War probably was a tremendous asset to the Democratic left, presumably where the right was so opposed to going into it, because they know there's a relationship between social mobilization and warfare. But the left is too dumb to see this, in this case. And then some of them are crack-potted enough to think that if it comes out like that, maybe it was all fixed to come out like this. You get a cultural hero made out of someone like Michael Moore, who's willing to deal in that kind of talk, more than willing to do it. And the man who would have made a perfectly good brown shirt. Actually, does make a perfectly good brown shirt. Marxism takes its point of departure from the study of real forces of production, conflict between forces and relations of production, study of capitalism, this kind of thing. Other people like to look for hidden financial conspiracies and so forth. That's the opposite of socialism. That's much more like just
to return to this issue about Kerry, he hasn't presented this as a choice. The party can go this way or the party can go this way. He's different. He occasionally panders to one side and he occasionally panders to the other side.
So it is a little unclear.
I think it's unclear. I think it's ambiguous. I think he doesn't want to alienate the far left or the anti-war left because he wants them to vote for him. And I think he wants to keep as much of the center on board as possible. So I think part of the reason why he's sounding so vague and it's so easy to criticize him for flip-flopping and so on this issue is that he's still playing to both audiences.
Joe Lieberman and Howard Dean were both willing to engage, although with different ends in mind, for a battle for the heart and soul of the Democratic Party.
But no, John Kerry does not want that.
He
does not want that. He certainly doesn't want it before the election. And this is why I say I don't know. After the election, what he's going to be, I can't say. He has a record in which he has been anti-military.
Supposing he wins.
Supposing he wins, for example. So no, I'm not assuming he's going to win. But he has been anti-military. I mean, if you look at his votes, they've been people who have done the tabulations. He's been consistently voted against the military when he can. He's been cautious about American engagement.
Right.
On the other hand, he's said several times that he supports the war on terror.
Stay the course in Iraq.
Stay the course in Iraq and so on. So what that.
Final topic, what the American left needs to do now. Reform the left for me. What do you do with the American left in ideologically or structurally? How do you tell the American left to be creative and to make positive contributions to American politics for the next decade or so?
In a brief way, I would say not to see the use of American force abroad as always negative, and not to identify with critics of the United States abroad simply because you want to criticize at home. In other words, you don't like the system, so you make friends with Mullah Omar. That I would cease that. Those are the two things I would say.
Christopher, reform the left.
I think that's very well. That's very well put. A very beautiful minimalism. Well, when I was on the Marxist left, the reason why I would have been proud to say I was internationalism, solidarity, taking the side of the oppressed, and being opposed to all forms of religious nonsense. the left is now in a position where it will not take the side of those in the Muslim world, the women who are enslaved, the minorities who are being physically destroyed, the gays who must be there somewhere, God knows what their lives are like, and others, against something that is self-evidently pornographically reactionary, and has therefore lost its character as a left, even as a secular liberal force. Won't even defend what it would demand for anybody living in the United States.
So
freedom from clerical
talking about reforming the American left is nonsense, because there is no longer an American left. There's just a kind of crackpot Michael Moore fringe.
That's about the size of it now, I have to say, yes.
Christopher Hitchens and Applebaum, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thank you for joining us. We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.